what I want to do is not to try to convince you that boycott is needed and useful, but rather try to get a little bit into the common arguments that people who oppose the BDS make, so that you will be equipped with answers to these common arguments, and you will take these arguments in the proper perspective. One of the very first arguments is that boycott is not effective, that boycott cannot achieve justice or cannot change Israeli society. As an example, they give the example of the Arab boycott against Israel that was very long and was only dismantled in the 90s, and that in many ways was not able to put effective pressure on Israel. Another example is the controversy regarding the South Africa boycott. Although the South African boycott had a tremendous political impact and a tremendous symbolic impact, there are many today who argue that in fact the boycott was not the most significant aspect of the struggle against South Africa, and that South Africa was able to cope with the international boycott quite successfully. And that is perhaps the main question that has to be answered. But before that, I think it's very important to clarify that the economic situation right now is not only that there is still no comprehensive boycott on Israel, but in fact that the international community, and especially Europe, is actually funding the occupation and helping Israel maintain the occupation. Israel is obligated under international humanitarian law to meet the needs of the population under its control in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, and of course it is obligated to treat its own citizens equally and fully, and it is obligated to allow the Palestinian refugees to return. Right, as Israel does not do any of these things, the international community has stepped in to fund the refugee camps for the Palestinian refugees, to fund the aid to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip, and what they're doing actually is taking the responsibility from the shoulders of the Israeli government. And not only that, but they are sending the aid to the Palestinians through the Israeli economy. They are buying the food from Israeli companies. They are using Israeli transportation companies to transfer the food, and the result is that the Israeli economy is profiting from the aid. Most importantly, all the donations come in foreign currency, but since the Palestinians are forced to use Israeli currency, then what it actually means is that as the donors convert their currency into Israeli currency in order to pay for their various expenses of aid, they have turned the occupation into one of Israel's major sources of export. Israel is exporting the occupation because the international community is willing to pay. And that means that the international community, although Europe and most countries in the world are quite clear in their policy to end the occupation, to end the injustice, they want Israel to comply with international law, but they are using a policy of carrots and no stick. Meaning that they try to help the Palestinian population under occupation with money, but they're not putting any pressure on Israel to make Israel accountable for its crimes. And that's why BDS is so important, because BDS is trying to balance that picture a little bit and make Israel also pay some economic price for the daily violation of international law, human rights, civil rights, and collective rights. But within that context, how can we hope that BDS will affect the Israeli economy? The Israeli economy seems to be very flourishing, and if you look at the headlines and the growth rate of the GDP, you can get the image as if Israel is an economy that didn't feel the international crisis, that is constantly in a state of growth and expansion. The reality is quite different from that. The reality is that the Israeli government is trying to hide the real economic situation in Israel, the massive unemployment and poverty that is spreading in Israel, in order to try to keep its legitimacy also in the face of its own public. And what's more, when we look at the traits, the characteristics of the Israeli economy, we see that it is extremely different than the economy of South Africa. Apartheid in South Africa fell in the 90s, when globalization was spreading around the world and international trade became so important for every country in the world almost. And Israel, in fact, is one of the most globalized economies there is. Israel, 70% of all imports to Israel are raw materials that Israel is using to process and export again. Because Israel, unlike South Africa, is very poor in natural resources, and therefore it needs the international community, it needs international trade in order to have a functioning economy. Israel is now the 10th biggest importer in the world in per capita terms, which means that on average Israelis import more than most countries in the world. And Israel is the 8th biggest exporter in per capita terms in the world. So Israel is very globalized. Israel is very sensitive to changes in trade, and Israel is also very dependent on foreign capital. Famous saying amongst Israeli economists is that the biggest import to Israel is money, because the Israeli economy has grown very dependent on the aid from the United States, on compensations for the Holocaust from Germany, that instead of reaching the Holocaust survivors have been stolen by the State of Israel and used to buy weapons, and donations by Jewish communities around the world. Now Israel is also a very divided society with a lot of discriminations inside it. Hazem talked before about the discrimination against Palestinian citizens in Israel, and that is of course very true. But the discrimination does not stop at one group. When you start to adopt a state that distinguishes among people based on their ethnicity, the color of their skin, the name, or their gender, then that kind of discrimination spreads. And that's why Israel is lagging behind all the developed countries in terms of women's rights and gender equality. Israel also discriminates against Jews that come from Arab countries, Jews that originate from Arab countries. What? Sorry?
Also, is this testing the war alarm?
Oh.
First Monday of every month since
Mondays. First Monday in the month.
Yeah, no, I'm used to this. Okay.
Sorry.
But what it means that Israel is such a divided society is that Israel also has lost most of its social resiliency and solidarity that it had during the age of the Arab boycott, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and is today a country with a very large percentage of the population that have become very impoverished, apathic, not interested in politics. About 60% of young Israelis want to leave the country. Most Israelis say that they don't believe Israel will exist in 50 years. So it is a state in crisis. The situation is not sustainable, and it's not sustainable even before BDS. But then that brings me to the next argument that people make against BDS. Then they say, well, wouldn't BDS then hurt these poor people in Israel, including Palestinians and the Palestinian subjects of Israel in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, who are not to blame for the occupation and the violations of international law?